In 1933, a quarter of all Americans who wanted to work couldn't find a job. 9,000 banks had collapsed. A third of the entire U.S. money supply had simply vanished. Families who had saved for decades watched everything disappear literally overnight. Not in a war, not in a natural disaster, but because of decisions made in quiet rooms by men in suits. Now, historians have blamed Wall Street greed, they've blamed Herbert Hoover, they've blamed reckless speculation, the gold standard, bad luck. But in 1963, Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman looked at all the evidence, every ledger, every policy memo, every Federal Reserve meeting transcript, and pointed his finger somewhere else entirely. Not at a corrupt politician, not at a robber baron, not even at an institution. At one man, a dying banker from rural New York who nobody outside of finance had ever heard of. And here's the twist that makes this story genuinely strange. He died 13 months before the Depression even started. His name was Benjamin Strong. And according to Friedman and later Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke himself, the fact that this man was no longer in the room is what turned a bad recession into the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Not what he did, what he couldn't do anymore once he was gone. Stick with me, because this story goes places you won't expect. To understand Benjamin Strong, you need to know one thing about his life before finance. Almost everything that could go wrong did. He was born in 1872 in Fishkill-on-Hudson, a small town in New York's Hudson Valley. Smart kid. Wanted to go to Princeton like his older brother. Couldn't afford it. His family hit financial trouble right as he graduated high school. So instead of a college education, he walked into a Wall Street clerk's office at 18 years old and started from zero. He was fired from his very first job. The reason? Poor penmanship. Most people would take that as a sign. Strong took it as fuel. He landed at a firm connected to the J.P. Morgan network, kept his head down, worked obsessively, and within a decade had become one of the most respected young bankers in New York City. By 1904, he was Secretary of Bankers Trust Company. By 1909, Vice President. By 1914, President, at 41 years old. On paper, a perfect American success story. But his personal life was quietly unraveling. In 1905, his wife Margaret gave birth to their fourth child. She developed what we would today recognize as severe postpartum depression. And within months, she took her own life. Strong's neighbor, Henry Davison, a partner at J.P. Morgan, took Strong's 4 children into his own home. Strong was left alone, devastated, and threw himself into the only thing that still made sense to him: work. He remarried. That ended too. His second wife left him in 1916 and moved to California, taking his daughters with her. The same year, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. So let's be clear about who this man was by the time he stepped into the most powerful, unelected financial role in America. A twice-abandoned father, slowly dying of a lung disease with no college degree, who had risen entirely on sheer force of intellect and will. That matters, because it explains the ferocity with which he approached his job. And his job, starting in 1914, was to run the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the largest, most powerful district in the entire Federal Reserve System. But before all of that, before the Fed even existed, there was 1907. October 1907. New York City is in the middle of a financial storm. A rumor spreads that the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the city's major banks, is about to go under. Within hours, thousands of depositors are lined up outside demanding their money back. The bank collapses in a single day. Panic spreads like a virus. Bank after bank, block after block, city after city. There is no Federal Reserve. There is no government safety net. There is no emergency mechanism of any kind. There is only one man who can stop it: J.P. Morgan, literally one private citizen. Morgan calls an emergency meeting. He gathers the most powerful bankers in America into his private library on Madison Avenue. A room lined with Renaissance paintings and rare manuscripts, and he locks the door. Nobody leaves until they agree to pool their personal fortunes and stop the bleeding. It works. Barely. But it works. Benjamin Strong is in that room, 35 years old, watching the whole thing unfold. And what he takes away from that experience is a question that will define the rest of his life. Why does the stability of the most powerful economy on earth depend on whether one elderly billionaire happens to be in the right city on the right day? 7 years later, in 1914, Congress creates the Federal Reserve System. And almost immediately, the question becomes, who runs the New York Fed, the biggest district, the one with the most power, the one that actually determines what American monetary policy looks like in practice? They come to Strong. He initially says no. He has concerns about the Fed structure. He thinks the political appointees in Washington won't understand banking well enough to make good decisions. He's right about that, as it turns out, but he's eventually persuaded, and on October 5th, 1914, at the Fed's very first Board of Directors meeting, Benjamin Strong becomes governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. One biographer would later call him the de facto leader of the entire Federal Reserve System. Not the official chairman. Strong never held that title. But in practice, every major decision flowed through him because he was the only person in the room who truly understood what he was doing. And for the next 14 years, sick, lonely, working from sanatoriums in the American West and European Alps during his worst stretches, conducting policy by telegraph when he couldn't travel, he held the whole thing together through sheer force of personality. Until he couldn't. Here's where the story gets complicated. And this is the part most people never hear. Benjamin Strong didn't just prevent a depression. He may have quietly set one up. After World War I, Britain was financially destroyed. The British pound, once the bedrock of the entire global financial system, was collapsing. The governor of the Bank of England, a man named Montague Norman, had become one of Strong's closest friends. They wrote each other constantly. They vacationed together in France. In the world of central banking in the 1920s, their relationship was the most consequential friendship in global finance. And Norman came to Strong with a problem. If American interest rates were high, money would flow from Britain to America in search of better returns. The pound would weaken further. Britain's already fragile economy might not survive. Norman's ask was delicate but direct. Keep American rates low. Give us room to breathe. Strong agreed. He believed, genuinely believed, that European stability was in America's long-term interest. That if Britain collapsed, the ripple effects would eventually reach American shores. So throughout the mid-1920s, Strong kept borrowing costs cheap. And cheap money does something very predictable. People borrow it and they invest it. The stock market began its famous ascent. The Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed from 63 points in 1921 to 381 points in September 1929, sixfold in 8 years. Ordinary Americans, factory workers, teachers, shopkeepers poured their savings into stocks, often borrowing to do it, sometimes putting up only 10 cents of their own money for every dollar invested. They called it buying on margin. Everyone was doing it. Everyone was getting rich. On paper. Strong watched this with growing unease. By 1927, he was attending Federal Reserve meetings with notes warning about speculative excess. He talked about the need to lean against the wind, to raise rates gradually before the bubble became impossible to manage. His colleagues on the Federal Reserve Board in Washington wanted to act more aggressively. Raise rates sharply, pop the balloon fast. Strong pushed back. Move too hard, too fast, he argued, and you don't just slow the market, you trigger a crash. He was caught between two dangers and trying to thread a needle, and his tuberculosis was getting worse. In the summer of 1928, he was so ill he could barely attend meetings. He spent weeks in hospital. His lungs, already damaged for over a decade, were failing. On October the 16th, 1928, Benjamin Strong died. He was 55 years old. The Dow Jones would peak 11 months later. And then the world his decisions had helped build began to come apart. October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday. The stock market doesn't fall. It doesn't correct. It collapses. Black Monday, October 28th. The Dow drops nearly 13% in a single day. Black Tuesday, October 29th. Another 12%. Investors who had borrowed to buy stocks found themselves owing more than their entire portfolios were worth. Margin calls went out. Stocks were liquidated in panic. The losses cascaded. But here is the single most important thing to understand about the Great Depression. And almost nobody knows this. The stock market crash alone did not cause it. Read that again, slowly. Because it overturns almost everything you were taught. The crash was bad. But economies recover from crashes. Markets recover from crashes. In the fall of 1930, a full year after Black Tuesday, many economists believed the worst might be over. The downturn was painful but survivable. What turned a bad year into a decade of ruin was what happened next. Starting in the fall of 1930, waves of banking panics swept the country. When rumors spread that a bank might be insolvent, depositors rushed to withdraw their savings. Banks, which only keep a fraction of deposits as cash, couldn't meet the demand. They failed. Then the panic spread to neighboring banks, then to entire regions. The Federal Reserve's response, almost nothing. And here's why. Strong had held the Federal Reserve System together by force of personality. He had kept the fractious governors of 12 different regional banks aligned behind a coherent policy. When they disagreed, and they always disagreed, Strong's authority settled it. As Friedman and Schwartz documented in painful detail, so long as Benjamin Strong was alive, his unquestioned preeminence kept the struggle submerged. His death triggered open warfare within the Fed. The New York district, which Strong had run, lost its dominant position. The Washington board, filled with political appointees who lacked deep banking knowledge, exactly what Strong had warned about in 1914, asserted control. And they froze. Some governors believed the banks deserved to fail, that this was the market correcting itself, that weak institutions should be allowed to collapse. Others wanted to act, but couldn't build consensus. The meetings went in circles. Meanwhile, the money supply contracted, families lost their savings, unemployment climbed. And then, incredibly, in September 1931, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates in the middle of a depression to protect gold reserves as Britain abandoned the gold standard. The money supply, already shrinking, contracted further. Between 1929 and 1933, the U.S. money supply fell by 31%. Not by accident, not by market forces, by the decisions of men sitting in Federal Reserve meeting rooms who could not agree on what to do, and ultimately did the wrong thing. 9,000 banks failed. 1 in 4 workers lost their jobs. In cities like Cleveland and Toledo, unemployment hit 50%. Farmers who couldn't pay mortgages watched their land auctioned off. Children went to school hungry. Men who had built businesses over a lifetime stood in bread lines. The question historians have debated ever since: would Benjamin Strong have stopped it? Fast forward to November 8, 2002, the University of Chicago, a birthday celebration for Milton Friedman, who had just turned 90 years old. Among the speakers is Ben Bernanke, then a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, later to become Fed chairman and steer America through the 2008 financial crisis. Bernanke stands up and says, on behalf of the Federal Reserve System, words that had never been spoken in the institution's history. Regarding the Great Depression, we did it. We're very sorry. We won't do it again. The Federal Reserve in the year 2002 confessed to causing the Great Depression. Bernanke was specifically referencing Friedman and Schwartz's argument. The argument that the Fed's catastrophic inaction, its failure to act as lender of last resort, its contraction of the money supply, had taken a recession and turned it into a catastrophe. And Friedman and Schwartz had pointed directly at Strong's absence as a central reason why that failure happened. This wasn't a fringe view. Britannica's entry on the Great Depression states it plainly. Strong's death left a power vacuum at the Federal Reserve and allowed leaders with less sensible views to block effective intervention. Now, and this is important, not everyone agrees. Some economists in the Austrian tradition argue the exact opposite, that Strong caused the bubble in the first place, that his easy money policies of the 1920s, his willingness to sacrifice American economic stability to help Britain, inflated the stock market beyond any sustainable level. That, without him, the 1920s never would have roared the way they did. And therefore, the 1930s never would have crashed the way they did. Both arguments can be true simultaneously. That's the uncomfortable reality. A man uses his extraordinary gifts to build a system that depends, dangerously, on his continued presence. He keeps it stable through intelligence and force of will. He knows it's fragile. He's working to fix it. And then he dies before he can. The house of cards doesn't fall because he built it wrong. It falls because the people who inherit it have no idea how delicate it was. 25 million Americans lost their jobs. 9,000 banks collapsed. Millions of families lost savings they had spent decades building. Entire communities were dismantled. The psychological scars lasted for generations. People who lived through the Depression never trusted banks again, never threw anything away, never stopped hoarding cash and mattresses and hiding money under floorboards. And at the center of it all, not a criminal, not a war, not an act of God. A dying man who ran out of time. Benjamin Strong is not a name most people know. You won't find him in the history books your kids bring home from school. He doesn't have a famous monument. There's no movie about him. He spent the last years of his life working from hospital beds and mountain retreats, conducting the most powerful financial institution in the world by telegraph, slowly losing a battle with tuberculosis while trying to hold a global economy together. He lost that battle on October 16, 1928, and 11 months later, the world he had spent his life trying to protect began its long fall. History doesn't always turn on the dramatic actions of conquerors or revolutionaries. Sometimes it turns on a single absence, a chair left empty at exactly the wrong moment, a voice that went quiet when it was most needed. Benjamin Strong's chair was empty for 13 months before the crash, and the men who sat in his place had no idea what they didn't know. That's not a political story. It's not even really an economic story. It's a story about what happens when the one person in the room who truly understands the stakes is no longer there to say, "Stop. This is how it works. This is what happens if you get it wrong." We've been living in the shadow of that empty chair ever since.